Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and the topic for today's webinar is load growth, what states are doing to accommodate increasing electric demand. And we have some excellent guest speakers with us today, but before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your webcam and microphone are disabled. The chat function is also disabled. If you would like to submit questions and comments, you can do so via the Q&A panel. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to address audience questions. So please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar, and we'll get to them at the end. Automated captions are also available, and speakers' bios will be made available in the chat. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a webinar recording within 48 hours, and it will also be posted on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today, my colleague Todd Olinsky-Paul.
Great, thanks, Zareen, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I'll do a brief introduction of CESA and tell you a little bit about what we do, and then I'll introduce the speakers for today, and then after they do their presentations, we will have lots of time for questions and discussion. So I'll say right up front that if you have a question or comment, please enter it into the questions, the Q&A box. There's a little icon at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, has a question mark. Just type it in as you think of it. Don't wait till the end, because I will be going through those as the presentations are going on and figuring out which ones are the most relevant and queuing those up for discussion. So I'll start by introducing CESA, Clean Energy States Alliance. We're celebrating 20 years of leadership in state clean energy policy and program support. CESA is a nonprofit. We are essentially a membership organization for state energy agencies. If you go to the next slide, please, Zareen, you can see here our members. Lots and lots of great people working in all of these agencies, trying to advance clean energy in their own states, and we work with all of them. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we do, we have lots of different projects. One of them is called Energy Storage Policy for States. This is a project through which we provide support to our members who are working on energy storage program policy development and regulation development. We have a regular monthly meeting for energy storage folks from all the states that want to come and share information about what they're working on and get expert input on questions they might have and areas of interest. If you are attending this webinar and you are working at a state agency and you'd like to join, please drop me a line. We are welcome anybody from a CESA state to join and attend that group. We also have a similar energy storage working group for state regulators and their staff, and you don't have to be a CESA member for that one. So drop me a line on that if you're from a regulatory agency, and we'll hook you up with that group. Next slide, please. So today we are going to be learning about load growth, which is something that I think everyone has been hearing a lot about, and specifically what's causing electric load growth, what the projections are looking like, what are some of the trends and characteristics, and then what are the states doing to accommodate and prepare for this. And so this is a new report, just came out in actually earlier this month. And Anna Boyd, who is a research fellow with CESA, is here today to walk us through the report and what the findings are. And then if you go ahead to the next slide, please, Zareen. After Anna speaks to the report, we have Charles Dawson with us from the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, who's going to share a bit about what his state is doing to accommodate and prepare for electric load growth. So I think that's it. If you go to the next slide, please. Yep, that's it for me. So I will pass the microphone over to Anna, and she'll take us through the report. Thanks very much. See you all during the question and discussion session.
Thanks so much, Todd, and thank you all so much for being here today and joining us as we discuss load growth. I'm really excited to talk to you about this report that we just released and go through, as Todd mentioned, some of the key trends we're seeing from states as they look to address load growth. Next slide. So I just want to start us off by talking about the key load growth drivers that are, at the top of mind for a lot of people right now, especially the first one, data centers. But in this report, we go over these three main drivers of load growth and look at how they're impacting state policy. So first, we have data centers, and then we have manufacturing and electrification that are also driving these increases that we're seeing in load growth. For data centers, I feel like every week there's a new news article about a data center, being planned, coming online or whatnot. And it's, a rapidly evolving landscape. However, I think it's also really important to know that with all of these drivers, they're happening at different rates and in different places throughout the country. So there's a lot of geographic variation in which states are dealing with which drivers and at what scale. So in terms of data centers, there's a high concentration of data centers in the mid-Atlantic, especially in Virginia, where you have data centers already making up over 25% of statewide electricity consumption. We also see a large amount of data centers being planned and coming online in places like Georgia and Texas, Pennsylvania, also, places like Ohio, Indiana, the Carolinas, and whatnot. So it is, there are a lot of states that are dealing with this, but, at different rates. Also, in terms of for energy planners, something that's really important is that the biggest challenge is that data centers are often operating around the clock with really high load factors, making it very challenging. Also, in terms of time frame, data centers, they're online now, they're coming online, they're going to be, continuing to come online. So this is very much a near-term driver of load growth. Next, turning to manufacturing, we've seen and are seeing a lot of growth there. A lot of it stems from federal investments in the past administration in terms of clean energy technologies. But there's also been lots of efforts for industry onshoring through import tariffs and grants for new manufacturing that are driving load growth here. Once again, there is some geographic variation in where we're seeing this. So the Midwest, in the PJM and MISO territory, Southeast, and many states in the West are seeing growth in manufacturing. In terms of load profile, there is more daily variation here, with often seeing it following typical work shifts during the day. And then once again, this is also a near-term driver of load growth. And then finally, I do want to talk about electrification. This is something that in many states that have been focused on clean energy and advancing climate policy, been planning for a while, but it is also something that is contributing significantly and will continue to load growth, especially later this decade and into the 2030s. However, certain states are already seeing load growth from electrification. You can see this in California, New York, and states in New England. In terms of load profile here, you have daily variation with morning and especially the late afternoon and evening peak when people come home from work. Also, beyond the daily variation, also there's some seasonal shifts that might be happening here that are likely happening in many states, where some areas will be shifting from summer to winter peaking systems as heating especially gets electrified. And a lot of this growth is from building electrification and transportation electrification. Next slide, please. So just to summarize high level some of the growth trends that we're seeing, and just to emphasize the scale, a report by Grid Strategies that came out at the end of last year projects that about a 15.8% increase in summer peak demand by 2029. And this is relative to 2024. I will also emphasize that while we use the term load growth very broadly in this report, mainly what we're focusing on is a growth in peak demand, as that's the biggest challenge for a lot of energy planners. Within this, data centers could account for 6.7 to 12% of forecasted total national electricity consumption by 2028. And these numbers come from a Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory report. Also with this, there's a lot of variation and uncertainty around load growth projections. Just an example here, this figure on this slide only is related to data centers, but I think it really illustrates a key trend and issue that we're dealing with here. We see the drastic spike in load growth, but we also see variation in the different projections, both across the different sources of these forecasts and the different scenarios they have in terms of like high growth case versus the medium and the low case. It related to data centers, a big challenge in forecasting is that oftentimes they're scouting multiple locations as they might appear in multiple forecasts, making some of it duplicative and really like adding to that uncertainty. And then once again, as emphasized in the last slide, when I was talking about the variation, geographic variation in different load growth drivers, load growth in general, like some states are dealing with really drastic growth while other states are not really having to address this issue in the same way. So it really does cause variation in state policy. And also in the report, I will emphasize that it really just highlights the states that are dealing with pretty drastic load growth. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to just get into some of the load growth strategies that we're seeing across the country, starting with supply side investments. So with this drastic spike in load growth, we're seeing a lot of return and a lot of renewed interest in expanding gas capacity. Some estimates say that about 94 gigawatts of new gas is included in integrated resource plans across the country to come online by 2035. And this is significantly increased just in the past like 2 years. So relative to the end of 2023, this is about 35 gigawatts higher. So there's a lot of renewed interest in building out gas capacity. And this is reflected in, as I mentioned, in resource plans across many states from many utilities. Some examples include Arizona, Georgia, Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Kansas, Nevada, Nebraska, and this is not even a complete list of all the states that are, looking to gas again. Also, beyond utility plans, some states are also doing making other, efforts to build out gas. For example, Texas, which definitely has had an interest in gas and fossil and in all of the above approach to supply side investments, has identified 17 gas plants for state-backed loans. While some of those might not actually get built due to supply chain issues, it does show this, clear interest here. And then also there are some, plants that are being built for specific data centers that also is driving an increase in gas capacity nationwide. Just beyond this build out in gas, we're also seeing delays in fossil plant retirements recently, specifically citing load growth, saying that they can't take these offline because of reliability concerns as we see significant growth. Estimates vary, but some say about 9,100 megawatts of capacity could be delayed in terms of fossil retirements. A lot of this is coal plants, but some gas and some like oil facilities as well. And these closure delays are being seen in many states, including West Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Illinois, Maryland, even New York delayed closing some peaking gas plants due to reliability concerns that were related to load growth. And I will note that in some of these states, this investment runs directly counter to their clean energy and climate goals. For example, Dominion's IRP in Virginia will not meet the state clean energy standards. And also in North Carolina, regulators basically exempted Duke from meeting some of the clean energy requirements there most recently. So we definitely are seeing, it'll be interesting to see how this continues to develop as states return to gas and fossil. Next slide, please. So on the supply side, it's not just fossil generation that we're seeing an interest in. There's a lot of interest in advance nuclear technology, especially as a carbon-free and dispatchable resource. A lot of this interest is around small modular reactors. States are developing plans for technology development. Utilities are adding SMRs to integrated resource plans. A lot of it scheduled to come online in like early 2030s, mid 2030s. And states are also creating incentives to accelerate deployment. A few examples of states are Virginia, Indiana, Tennessee, Arizona, Texas, New York. And of course, there are also many others here as well. Also, we'll note that there also is interest among especially data center, like hyperscale data center operators in existing nuclear capacity or even from shuttered facilities. For example, Microsoft is arranging to purchase power from the 3 Mile Island plant, which is currently closed. And Amazon also was trying to directly get power from a nuclear facility in Pennsylvania. That agreement was denied by FERC, but we see this trend here and this interest in nuclear. And then lastly, I do want to touch on renewable energy and storage, even though I will note that this is an area where there wasn't as much of a change and a trend in the recent years from spikes in load growth. A lot of it is largely continuing on existing growth trends that predate this. But with that, battery storage deployment is continuing to grow. That doubled in 2024. And for example, CAISO, California operates over 11,000 megawatts of energy storage. Next slide, please. So continuing on state strategies, but moving away from supply side resources, states, and many of them for a while now, for years, have had various demand response and efficiency programs. As mentioned, these largely have predated these spikes in load growth, but a lot of states that have aggressive climate goals really have an interest in leveraging demand response to reduce peak load. And a lot of programs are in like California, Massachusetts, and Oregon are just a couple of examples. Also, New York has been studying grid flexibility potential to address climate and electrification goals. And moving away from demand side strategies, transmission is an area that is really key for meeting load growth, but particularly also for integrating renewables. And after years of pretty underinvestment in transmission, over the past year, there have been a lot of new transmission investments approved across different regional transmission independent system operators. And so as you can see here, for example, 21.8 billion in planned investment within MISO's territory. Next slide, please. So next, I do want to move to some other strategies that states are, taking to think about, how to meet load growth. And something that came up in a lot of places is broad concern around ratepayer cost shifts related to serving these new large loads, and then also the risk to certain utilities if the load doesn't materialize. So in a lot of states, there's been a rise in special tariffs that specifically look to address these issues. For example, the Georgia Public Service Commission recently issued new power usage terms that focus on longer contract terms for large loads, and also require these large load customers to pay for more of the costs and upgrades that are associated with serving their load. Additionally, similar trends in Indiana and in Ohio, where there have been settlement agreements approved by the regulatory commissions there that both include, requirements for these customers to once again pay for necessary upgrades, also including different downsizing requirements, for example, and exit fees in Indiana if, for instance, the large load user ends up needing to use less, or the project doesn't actually get off the ground. And similarly, in Ohio, in the recently approved agreement, this even is more recent than when the report was released. It was just a week or so ago. Large load customers will be required to pay a minimum of 85% of projected energy use, whether or not they use it. And then similarly, Duke Energy is adding minimum take clauses to large load tariffs, similar to requirements to pay like 85% whether you use it or not. But that directly relates to the risk if the load doesn't materialize and there's a lot of extra capacity built to serve them. Next slide, please. Related once again to tariffs, but a little bit different. We've had clean energy, tariffs for like allow, different users to get more clean energy in a lot of states that predate load growth, but these are specifically related to the load growth we've seen recently and specifically often data centers. So in Nevada, there's now a clean energy transition tariff, and this will allow customers to partner with utilities and power developers to fund new technologies. This was a big effort by Google that was looking to partner with a geothermal developer. And also in the Carolinas, Duke Energy has an accelerating clean energy tariff, which will include, it has financing options for new clean energy technology and individualized clean energy portfolios for commercial and industrial customers. Next slide, please. So finally, before I get into some areas for additional research, I just do want to show how data centers in load growth from data centers specifically have been on the legislative agendas in a lot of states recently. And a lot of this interest and this proposed legislation does surround this idea of cost shifts and like how you pay for the cost of serving these new large loads, and then some to do with efficiency. But once again, similar to the motivation for the large load tariffs, and even some of this legislation is like, having commissions develop them, we see the focus on protecting ratepayer groups from data center service costs. So in Maryland, legislation was passed to develop new rates for data centers and prevent cost shifts. Legislation in a similar vein recently passed in Oregon. In Texas, there was legislation that passed that will prevent duplicative interconnection requests, require large load customers to pay transmission fees, and also very interesting, give the grid operator more authority to curtail large loads during emergency load shed events. And building off of that, there's proposed legislation in California to create tariffs to prevent cost shifts and promote clean energy. And also similar legislation was unsuccessful recently in Virginia. I will note about Virginia over the past, they have a lot of data centers in Northern Virginia. And over the past few legislative sessions, data centers have been on the agenda. However, most legislation related to data centers has failed to pass, and that continued to be the trend this year. And then in terms of data center energy efficiency, we're starting to see some movement here in state legislatures. In California's proposed legislation to provide tax cuts to data centers that are relying on clean energy and require energy usage reporting and set efficiency standards. And in Virginia, there was also unsuccessful legislation to tie tax incentives to efficiency standards. Next slide, please. And just to close us out before I pass things over to Charles here, I do want to just briefly mention some areas for additional research. One key area, and this, a few of these bullets relate to this top one, is like opportunities for states to ramp up renewable energy generation and storage deployment. A key area here will be looking into policies around interconnection queue reform and siting reform to expand renewable energy and energy storage deployment, because a lot of renewable and storage projects are stuck in interconnection queues. Also related to that, building out high voltage transmission and improving that planning process to better have renewables serve load centers and bring resources to where they're needed. Also looking into data center load flexibility, as I mentioned in the beginning of this. A lot of it is, they operate around the clock, they're not very flexible, but looking into whether that is an area where there could be movement and whether that could change. And also related to that, like thinking about demand response related to data centers and other large load customers and virtual power plants, and how those could factor in terms of expanding different ways that we can address load growth. And then finally, forecasting is a really big challenge. A lot of load, you don't know if it's going to happen or not. We see new announcements and whatnot. So improving the way that forecasting is done to better understand what resources are really needed to prevent, overbuilding and stranded assets. I will stop there for now and pass it over to Charles. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Charles, you are muted. You should unmute your microphone.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Todd, and thanks, Anna, for setting up this conversation. I think that a couple of the points that you talked about on the last slide are showing up in Massachusetts. So I'm, happy to talk more about those on these slides and then talk more about them in the Q&A. So for introduction, my name is Charles. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. For those who aren't familiar, DOER is the state energy office in Massachusetts, and we support the Commonwealth's clean energy policy, and our mission is to support a clean, affordable, resilient, and equitable energy system for all residents of the Commonwealth. I'll say as a disclaimer is that I'm not speaking officially on behalf of the department, but I work actively in a lot of these areas and hopefully can provide some perspective. Next slide, please. So to connect the load growth that Anna was talking about on a nationwide perspective down to Massachusetts, I think that it's helpful to walk through some of the specific patterns and trends that we're seeing in Massachusetts and in New England as a broader region, because of course we're part of the broader ISO New England grid. And I think that we can explore this through a tale of three load curves that help illustrate this story. So of those, the three categories of load growth that Anna mentioned in terms of data centers, manufacturing growth, and electrification, the load growth that we expect to see in Massachusetts specifically is really centered on that last pillar of electrification. We're seeing, I think, very limited data center development relative to other states, especially in this 1 gigawatt plus range that is, setting off this conversation in states like Virginia. We're seeing relatively limited growth in that category, but we are expecting quite substantial load growth from electrification, and primarily electrification of transportation, so EVs, and then heating electrification. So this slide shows the state's modeling as part of the Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Pathways report, showing a forecast for heating and transportation electrification as the state decarbonizes to meet our state mandated decarbonization targets. And so what we see is looking out beyond the 2020s into 2030, 2040 and beyond, we're expecting quite substantial load growth from both of these categories, heating and transportation. In the near term, the balance is going to be primarily leaning on EVs driving this peak load growth. Then sometime around the mid-2030s, we're expecting a transition to a winter peaking system in ISO New England, at which point heating electrification, so heat pumps primarily, will become the main driver of this peak load demand. And this is a challenge for the region because if we go to the next slide, please, we can see that this sort of demand growth isn't something that we've seen in New England for several decades. So really going back all the way to 2000, so the start of restructuring in the New England region, we haven't seen any sort of substantial load growth on the scale that we're anticipating over the coming few decades. So there was some initial load growth that we saw in the early 2000s, and then 2008 was the passage of the Green Communities Act in Massachusetts, the beginning of the development of the energy efficiency programs in Mass, which have had tremendous successes in bringing down peak loads from building energy use, lighting energy use, and the like. And then over the last 20 years, essentially, even though the state's population has been growing, the state's economic output has been growing, we haven't seen the peak electrical demand grow in quite the same way. And so, looking back 20 years, the load profile looks quite different from the peak load growth that we're expecting over the next 20 to 30 years. And this is a challenge because it's really a change in how we need to approach planning the grid, planning the energy supply. And it's changed from the experience of most people working in energy for the last 20 years in New England. And so this brings us to today, and I have an example in the next slide where we can just see an example of what does the peak load look like today on the grid, and what are some of the strategies that we're already deploying to meet some of this peak load. So this was June 24th of this year. For those of you who are in Massachusetts or in New England, you probably remember this day. I think it hit at least 99 or maybe over 100 and very humid. So much higher temperature and heat index than even the grid operator, ISO New England, was expecting in the forecast. There was a higher electrical demand than anticipated, and several outages on the supply side that contributed to a capacity scarcity event on the 24th. This is a great example, I think, because it shows like what does peak electrical load look like today in Massachusetts, and what are we already seeing being used to meet the challenge of peak demand. And so the first thing right off the bat is that this dark blue curve here is showing the net load in the ISO New England grid. And the green line here is showing the behind the meter solar contribution. So already we're seeing on top, or hiding behind this net load, we're seeing 5 gigawatts of behind the meter rooftop solar, which is contributing to help with meet some of this peak load. So it's 5 gigawatts in the middle of the day, a smaller capacity that's being able to contribute during the evening hours, but nevertheless is contributing substantially to reduce the peak load and the costs that we would be seeing otherwise. There are a few other things that we can see in this, looking into the example of this peak day. So in addition to behind the meter solar, which ISO New England estimates separately, so we're able to show the curve for that, there is kind of this hidden missing around 2 gigawatts of load due to energy efficiency efforts over the last several years, really over the last 2 decades. And in addition to those missing, the hidden gigawatts from energy efficiency, we can see specific peak load reduction from the demand response programs, not only in Massachusetts, but throughout New England. So Massachusetts has the Connected Solutions program, which has smart thermostats, residential behind the meter batteries, commercial demand response, often using batteries as well. And then the other New England states have similar programs where they use these customer-cited resources to help bring down the peak on these peak days. And so on this day in particular, where 100-degree day, several outages from gas generating plants, the grid was really nearing its peak capacity. We saw over the course of 15 minutes, right at 5 p.m., which is the start of the dispatch window for a lot of these programs, we saw more than half a gigawatt of demand shed off of the peak as a result of this. And anytime a program has a effect that we can see on the region-wide load curve, I think that's a success, and that's something worth celebrating. And this is not just on the 24th, but it's also a demand reduction that we see reliably across these summer peak days. We've seen this over the last several weeks after the 24th, and really for the last 2 to 3 years, we've been seeing a substantial contribution from demand response. So hopefully this helps kind of understand the current state of Massachusetts and New England approaches to demand management and what we're doing to meet some of this load growth. I can summarize in the next slide some of the other policies that we're using to meet this challenge, and a number of these are called out on his presentation and in the report. So first off, we're continuing to support clean generation, both solar and storage in the New England region. I'm not personally aware of any new gas generation in Massachusetts, but we are really excited about the policies that we have to support solar and storage and renewables more generally. In particular, I'll call out these new smart regulations that were released just recently by my colleagues in the renewables division here at DOER to provide more certainty and support for the solar industry, to bring more capacity online. So we saw the 5 gigawatts of behind the meter solar on the previous slide, hoping to continue to invest in that capacity. We're also working on interconnection reform, which is another category that Anna highlighted in her presentation. Our office is working primarily at the distribution level, so working for distribution-sited renewable energy assets, DERs, to help them help build out hosting capacity proactively so that those resources can come online when they're needed without costly interconnection upgrades or delays. We're also working with regional partners and with ISO New England on transmission expansion, so I can highlight the recent longer-term transmission planning effort, which was a grid need identified by the New England States Committee on Electricity, which is a council of New England state governments that identified a need for additional transmission to bring renewable capacity from Maine down into the rest of New England. NESCO, and there's an amazing federal and regional affairs team here at the Executive Office of Massachusetts that was able to work on that RFP, and we're now soliciting transmission solutions for that need. And then we're also taking a hard look at load management, so both energy efficiency and demand response, to build on the success that we've seen in Massachusetts and in the region, using these tools to address peak load. And in particular, DOER is currently running a peak potential study where we're trying to quantify the amount of peak load reduction capacity that we see from various flexible end uses. And as a shameless plug here, we have public workshops for that study, both at the end of this month and in September. And I believe we have a link later on in the presentation that you can use to register for that and get more information. And on the next slide, I can just provide a preview of what we'll be talking about in this peak potential study, where we're going to be starting with our analysis of our forecast of what we expect to be driving load growth over the coming decades, things like EVs, things like heat pumps. But we'll also be looking at the periods of time where we expect the electricity grid to be most stressed. So looking at the hours of peak net load, hours of high reliability risk, and then understanding how can both active load flexibility and passive energy efficiency help meet those grid needs in those peak hours. And what we're looking at getting into in this study is not just how much flexibility is available from each specific end use, but how do those sources of flexibility stack together? Because we know that when you have a gigawatt of EV flexibility, if you have a gigawatt of heating flexibility, those don't necessarily stack together to 2 gigawatts. So we want to understand what's the coincidence between those end uses, how can they work together as an overall portfolio of load management. And then as a result of this study, we're hoping to identify what is the kind of supply curve, what are these resources that are on the table for the state to use to address peak load growth and reliability and affordability risks from that growth, and then what's needed to unlock, what new policies, programs, rates are needed to unlock that demand response capability. So I mentioned we'll have more public workshops on this later in the summer, and we're hoping to release the report and our policy recommendations in the fall. And if you want more information about this study or the links to register for those workshops, there's a link here on the slide. And just before I close and open it up for, I believe, the Q&A, on the next slide, just to provide some thoughts on where we see the next frontier of peak load reduction, peak load management in Massachusetts. So I mentioned that, our biggest challenge of the 3 pillars that Anna mentioned is really around electrification. And so I think the next frontier for us is understanding, kind of three large categories, in addition to the peak potential study that I mentioned earlier. The first category is, I think a lot of the conversation and a lot of the focus so far, for good reason, has been focused on meeting peak generation capacity needs and often peak transmission capacity needs. But what we're seeing in Massachusetts is that there are a lot of emerging needs and a lot of emerging bottlenecks at the distribution level. And so we're interested in understanding what are the tools, both the policies and the technologies, that can help us address peak load on the distribution system and hopefully defer or avoid investments in distribution system infrastructure to support electrification. The second category is around the gas to electric transition in Massachusetts. So we're working with our utilities, and our both electric and gas utilities are engaged in integrated energy planning in Massachusetts to understand how we can support an orderly transition from gas to electric heat in the Commonwealth. This will involve substantial load growth, although bringing substantial efficiency gains for that end use. But there's a question about how we can use things like demand response, things like energy efficiency, to help meet the grid needs from heating electrification. And then finally, we're also tracking a number of issues around large load interconnection. I mentioned in Massachusetts that we're not seeing the same sort of large 100 megawatt, 1 gigawatt data center interconnection issues, but we are seeing large loads trying to interconnect in the form of EV charging stations, electric bus depots, large buildings that are trying to electrify. We've seen all of these loads face challenges in getting timely and affordable grid capacity to interconnect. And so we're interested in understanding how can these load management strategies that we're currently studying help us interconnect those resources and help customers in Massachusetts electrify and increase their loads, affordably and reliably. So with that, I'll turn it over to Todd, and I think we have the Q&A next.
All right, thank you very much, Charles and Anna. If you could both come back on camera. So great, very, very interesting. A lot of information being presented here. I appreciate it. We have a lot of very good questions and about 20 minutes to address those. So I'll get to as many as we can. First one is, and this is for both of you, I think, and this is kind of one of the takeaways of the report. The question is, why isn't there more supply side growth for renewables in view of demand load growth? So, obviously there are states that have well-established RPSs or 100% clean energy goals, and they're continuing to work toward those. But I think one of the things you noted in the report, Anna, is that there's no obvious big push to accelerate clean energy, renewable energy, in order to try to meet this projected increase in demand. It's more of a combination of other things. And why is that? So why don't you take this first, and then Charles, maybe you can speak to this from your perspective in Massachusetts.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, and it's a really good one, a really interesting one. Yes, as we were noting, hasn't been the same, being like, okay, we have load growth now, we need to meet it with renewables. I think there are a few reasons here. Some of it, I'm hypothesizing a little bit here, but because there's been a lot of, there's been a lot of discussion around it, but it's, hard to say definitively sometimes. A few things. So, going back to Charles mentioned, like interconnection delays, that could be a big part of it. Transmission capacity also could be a factor in this. Also, if you look at some of the states that are seeing a lot of this growth, they're historically have had a high reliance on fossil fuels, and some of them have not been building out renewables at the scale of states that have had really aggressive clean energy standards. And so a lot of them are going back to what used to be their business as usual a little bit there. I've also, another thing that has come up in the research is, how how renewables are credited in terms of their ability to meet peak demand, and how in different states can be different, and it can really sometimes devalue renewables, especially if they're not built in conjunction with storage. So that the capacity accreditation has definitely come up as a reason within that. And then I think also siting delays also could be playing a role in this as well. So I think it's a multiple factors, and I'm really curious to hear, Charles, what it's been for you all in Massachusetts, because I think it does really vary. But I think there is, some of these states have long relied on fossil, and so going back to it is kind of going back to what they've done as business as usual. Also, some the utilities, like in the compensation models also for that large build out, also play a role.
Yeah, I'll just add on that just double underlining the interconnection point. I think that for the last almost 10 years now in Massachusetts, we've seen substantial interest from renewable developers. We've seen substantial development pressure. But since almost 2018, 2019, we've seen very substantial interconnection bottlenecks. And so, I think we'd love to have more renewables on the grid. I think the people building renewables would love to have more on the grid. But there's a bottleneck there. And it's something that as a state, we're trying to address through reform, both working through the stakeholder process at ISO New England, and working with our electric distribution companies on reform for distribution connected renewable energy. I think in both of those cases, the themes are moving towards more proactive analysis, more proactive planning of the grid. And particularly on the distribution side, we're looking towards developing a framework where we can proactively develop capacity for new renewables so that it's ready when a project is ready to be built and connected, rather than having to submit a study, wait for results, potentially pay a large fee, wait several years, hoping to move towards a more proactive approach that can hopefully reduce some of these delays and costs.
Great. I should probably mention that we recently, I guess last year, put out a report on interconnection bottlenecks, specifically having to do with energy storage. And we will be following that up within the next 6 months or so with another one that is going to look at what approaches are being taken in various states across the country to addressing those bottlenecks. And obviously Massachusetts is one of the states that has been most going after that with some vigor, but there are other approaches in other states as well. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, a couple of questions that are kind of have the same or trending toward the same thing here. One person says gas turbines have multi-year lead times, and the federal government has removed tax incentives for solar and wind. Are we facing large cost increases for electricity? And then another person says, I think I'm like most everyday people who want affordable, clean electricity to heat and cool my home. Relative to that, I really don't care about more AI in my life or Bitcoin trading, and I don't want to pay for that. Do state regulators across America understand that? So kind of two related questions. Are we looking at just cost increases that have to do with just, costs of more generation and more transmission, and more demand side management and all of those things that cost money, and what's being done at the regulatory level to try to shield the average ratepayer from those costs? I know you mentioned some of that, Anna, in your summary. Do you see, is there any kind of emerging movement on the part of ratepayers or groups that represent ratepayers, saying, wait a minute, this is, AI is great and everything, but, why do we have to pay for all this?
Yeah, I can start with that, and yeah, great and very relevant questions right now. I will start by saying that, just like the articles that pass like my feed on different platforms, I'm seeing like a lot of discussion and concern about, rate increases. Rates are already high in a lot of places. Energy affordability is a huge issue. As I mentioned, the special tariffs, a lot of the aim in that is to address cost shifts. However, they have, a dual goal, which is also, reducing risk for the utility. So it's not only about reducing the cost shifts. So I think it is an area that is continuing to develop. We need to continue to watch. I think it's a really valid concern, and I'm not sure that there's a commission that clearly has that answer right now, but I think it's on the agenda in almost all of the states that we looked at in the report, and that there are those concerns around it. I also do want to go back to something you said earlier about like the, supply chain issues around gas plants. That is also very real. And I think it's something that hasn't necessarily been addressed enough in a lot of utility plans, and also could be a driving reason for why we see this emphasis on retirement delays. Because when you have, both issues getting, whether it's renewables or new gas plants online, the delays are that's a reason that they're citing for that. It's like, we have this load growth now, we're not able to meet it unless we delay retirements, which of course have their own host of issues around it and continuing fossil generation pollution around that. So I think I don't have the exact answer. It is something commissions are thinking about. I think there needs to be a lot of continued work around affordability, and I think that is a huge concern that people have right now.
Great, thanks. Charles, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that or not. It's up to you.
Yeah, I'll say that, not since we're not like grappling with the same issue of 100 megawatt large loads in Massachusetts, I don't think there's an active conversation on these, a dedicated large load tariff, although I imagine we definitely look into that if it ever became an issue. But I think the broader question of cost shifts among customers is definitely still top of mind. I can say in the context of interconnection, where we're building grid upgrades to support new solar and storage interconnection, we need to realize that those upgrades have value to different users of the grid. They may be driven by interconnection needs for DERs, but they may be bringing a reliability benefit or a benefit to electrification. And so part of the interconnection cost allocation discussion in Massachusetts is how do we understand, what part of these grid upgrades are specific to solar and storage, what parts of them are providing shared benefits, and then how do you make sure that each customer class is only contributing their fair share of the costs. And I think the flip side of that coin is that also, thinking about electrification in particular, there are also cost shifts involved, but they tend to go the other way. And that someone who adopts electric heat today under a volumetric cost of electricity, they end up over contributing to the cost of service. So they're paying more than their marginal cost to serve if they've electrified their heating in the winter. And that's why we're pushing on policy changes like our seasonal heat pump rate in Massachusetts, which attempts to kind of help address some of that cost shift and end that over collection from electric heating customers, and hopefully make it more affordable and more attractive for customers to switch to electric heat.
Well, that's a good lead in to the next question, which is has to do with thermal storage. So usually when we talk about energy storage, we're talking about batteries or possibly flywheels, but there's a whole other set of technologies around this thermal storage. And so the question is, given that data centers and building electrification are largely thermal energy needs, how do you see the role of thermal energy storage? What are some of the associated challenges?
I can start off on this one. I think thermal storage is a really exciting category, especially because it can take so many forms. It's everything from a very high tech, like we're seeing these heat batteries coming out of startups and partnering with large facilities, but it can be all the way down to, insulation on your home creates a thermal storage asset, or your water heater is a thermal storage asset. And so I think that, we're interested in, all of the different forms of thermal storage on the residential side. We're interested in understanding these, complementary benefits between, if you give someone additional insulation in their home, that then potentially improves their ability to act as a demand response asset, because they potentially have, better thermal resistance, better thermal capacity in the home. I think a category that we're also actively exploring in Massachusetts is thermal networks, especially in the context of the gas to electric transition. So I believe that there is a pilot project in Framingham, Massachusetts, in Eversource electric territory, where they're installing a ground loop geothermal system that can serve multiple houses. And that's another example of a thermal storage technology where you can store energy in the ground loop, and then you can use it to heat and cool houses without as much peak demand on the grid. So I think it's a broad spectrum of technologies, but I think they have a lot of potential for especially addressing some of these electrification peak loads.
This is an area that didn't come up as much in the state strategies, so really appreciate what you just said about that, Charles. I think that, just generally in terms of thinking about storage and whatnot, as we look for ways to address peak load, will be key in many different ways. I think it's developing in terms of partnerships between different, companies that are driving the data center demand, and how they're developing these new technologies to try to, have more on-site resources. But there are not a lot of specifics came up in terms of state strategy on thermal storage in this particular report.
Great, thank you. Charles, this question is specifically to one of your slides. And several people asked this. And the question has to do with the decline. One of the slides, there was a chart, and it appears to show that transportation load demand declines between 2040 and 2050. And so I'm not sure whether that's a correct interpretation of the chart, and if it is, then what's going on there? And if not, what's the chart actually supposed to be indicating?
Yeah, sharp eyes. So what the chart is showing is it's showing the composition of demand during the peak hour. And what we're seeing there is that the peak hour shifts in the modeling between 2030 and 2040 and beyond. So in the near term, the peak hour of the year is usually a summer evening. So it's usually the hottest day of the summer. It's usually around 5 to 9 p.m., somewhere in there. And that's a time where AC demand is high. People are coming home and they're plugging in their electric vehicle to charge. And so in the near term, electric vehicles are contributing a lot to that peak demand because they're highly coincident. They're charging at the same time as everyone else is using peak electricity. We expect the ISO New England system to shift from summer peaking to winter peaking. So as we add more heat pumps to electrify heating, the winter peak will grow and the peak will shift from this hottest evening of the summer into the coldest morning of the winter. And so, it's not as clear cut as that because we still expect to see peaks kind of in the summer and in the winter for a dual peaking period. But what that chart is showing is that, the peakiest hour is like a January cold morning. And at that point, the contribution from heating is a lot higher. And most people's EVs have stopped charging by that point because they've had the whole night to charge. And so it's not that there are fewer EVs in 2050, it's just that they're contributing less to that peak hour. But good catch.
Okay, so we're not saying that for some reason EVs are going to get wildly more efficient during that decade or something like that. It's just the contribution to the peak is going to change because the peak itself is going to shift and so forth.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think it speaks to the need for, when we're talking about these customer-sided solutions and demand response, the need for a portfolio of assets. Like there's no one demand side technology that's going to be able to meet all of the grid needs. And so we need to be looking at this as a portfolio of EVs, smart thermostats on the residential side, commercial demand response, and understanding how those can work together to provide an overall load reduction.
Great. There was a question about local actions, and I know that obviously the report, you're both talking about state level actions, and we at CESA deal mostly with state level activities and policymaking. But I guess I'll throw it out to both of you if either of you or both could respond. Is there any action or trend emerging of local actions, and what that I think would look like would be, for example, citing moratoria for data centers or it depends on the state, obviously, and some states are home rule states where all of these kinds of siting and zoning decisions are made on a local level. New York, for example, is a home rule state. So unless there's some state law that takes it out of the purview of the local authorities, then it's a local decision. And we've seen in the past with technologies like wind turbines, for example, that there's been a lot of local activity, moratoria, changes in zoning and permitting rules and so forth, because people are trying to control where and when those things can be built. Is that happening at all with large, load facilities like data centers? Right? Have you seen anything like this?
It's a great question. it didn't come up as much in the research for this particular report, but I will note that I have colleagues at the University of Michigan, where I was recently studying, that have been looking at the issue more locally in Michigan. And there have been a lot of concerns about local environmental impacts of data centers that are popping up here. And there has been like local resistance to them. Whether that will, unclear at this point what that will lead to, but I know that that has been something that's really becoming like on the radar of different communities here, especially the ones that will be located near the data centers. This report was about energy load growth. There's also a lot of issues and concerns around water usage and water impacts from data centers for communities around them. I know that that is a concern related to a data center that's being developed in Western Michigan right now. So I think it is something that's happening in terms of the ability to really change where they're going to be located and whether they will be developed. That is something I can't directly speak on, but I know it's something that has been on the mind of communities. And I know there's also a lot of concerns right now around how most states do have a lot of tax incentives for data centers, you know, because, you know, citing employment benefits and jobs from them. And there have been a lot of concerns around that and whether those jobs materialize, and also what those do for impacts on load growth and water and other environmental impacts. So I'm curious to hear and to keep looking into what this means on a local level.
Great. And I don't know, Charles, whether that's anything you can or want to address or not from the perspective of Massachusetts.
I think Anna did a great job. I think at a local level, you know, I think most of us are energy nerds and we spend all of our time thinking about energy policy, but local policymakers, local governments have a lot of different concerns that they're trying to balance, and energy may not always be top of mind for them. I think especially thinking about the second pillar that Anna had on her slide of manufacturing growth, where that's an area where local communities may have a strong interest to attract that, and you know, maybe the energy policy concerns are not top of mind, so they have to strike that balance.
Great. Okay. I think this is going to be our last question. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them, and it is after 2:30, but I did want to get this one in because it is relevant to a federal ruling, which is FERC Order 1920. And that has to do with the ability, enhancing the ability of states to participate in regional transmission planning and expansion of regional transmission capacity, and it's specifically related to projected increases in electricity demand. And obviously, one of the big, you know, the major role of the transmission grid is to shift generation from place to place, you know, so it gets to where it needs to go. And if you have bottlenecks in that at that level, there are big impacts. So I don't know if this is something you came across, Anna, or whether this is something, Charles, that you know, Massachusetts is involved in, or whether you have any thoughts about it whatsoever, but I'm throwing it in there as it is a question that came from a listener, and I just think it's worth noting this regional transmission level.
I can start briefly. Actually, go ahead, Charles, if you have.
I can say, I think like the general saying on transmission is that the best time to build a transmission line was 10 years ago, and the second best time is now. I think that most regions are behind on their regional transmission build out, the potential exception of Texas with some of the proactive planning, but they're under a different regulatory framework than most RTOs. I mentioned that, you know, Massachusetts and the New England states have recently collaborated on a request for proposals for new transmission driven by, you know, state identified needs. I'm not as familiar with the details of that. We have an excellent team at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs here in Massachusetts that works with ISO New England. They put together that RFP and are working with ISO to develop that intra-regional transmission planning. I think the inter-regional part is another can of worms, but I think is even farther from reality at this point.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add on this. Not like an expert on this for cooling, but just will like comment on just the need to transmission and the challenges in it, and that in order to really, you know, build out renewables to their full potential, we will really need to be able to plan like across different regions, and how that's a huge challenge to get everyone on the same page with that. And it has been an area where there just hasn't been the investment that's needed. And so that will just be it's such an important area, and also will be a really huge factor in whether we're able to really build out renewables to the scale that we need to.
Great. Well, thank you both. This has been really, really interesting and lots of great information. I apologize to those who posted a question up and we didn't get to it. We did the best we could. It's 2:35 and we need to close out. Want to thank everybody for coming and attending. Zareen, do we have any upcoming events that you wanted to mention before we go?
Yes, we have two upcoming webinars. On August 11th, we have Geothermal Networks, an Opportunity for States. And on August 13th, we have Assessing Hydrogen for Long Duration Energy Storage, Use Cases, Costs, and Affordability Concerns. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and thanks, Anna and Charles.
Great. Thanks, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye.